Welcome everyone, and many thanks for joining us today. My name is Onur İşçi. I'm an assistant professor of international relations at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, and the director of Bilkent Center for Russian Studies. The Global Middle East Seminar Series is the product of a new partnership between the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and Bilkent University's Center for Russian Studies. The goal of the Global Middle East Seminars is to bring scholars of the Middle East from around the world to explore new and relevant findings of their research on the region's recent past. The idea for the seminar series was born in October 2019, when our two organizations launched a partnership with a conference on the Middle East, archival sources, hosted by Bilkent University. That conference was really exciting, and we were hoping to organize a second, but the global pandemic forced us to switch to an online format. And even though we're not, able to host an in-person conference, we thought that we could just put together an equally exciting program for the spring. And so far, we've held 3 seminars. Today, we're delighted to be hosting our 4th webinar on Iran, Iraq, and the international order of the 1980s. And we have only 1 webinar left in our monthly seminars. And I hope that these sessions can help foster a network of like-minded researchers and become a forum for future events. With us today are my colleagues from Bilkent, Eliza George and Sam Hurst, who helped with the organization of the seminar series. Eliza is in the audience room. Sam Hurst will be moderating our panel today. And we have the privilege of hosting Professors Teetzen and Noonan, who will be discussing their this very interesting subject with my good friend and colleague, Barin Kayaoğlu, who's also a Bilkent, is one of us. And before giving the floor to Professor Hurst, who will serve as our moderator today, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our participants and the audience, but I also owe a big thank you to our partners in Washington, D.C., to Dr. Christian Osterman, Director of the History and Public Policy Program, but also to Kian Byrne, Charles Krauss, Peter Bierstaker. Thank you all. And Sam, the floor is yours. Welcome to our 4th webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Onur, for that introduction and for the expression of gratitude, which I will only second, so that we can jump into the content of today's event. And my role is to host this. Timothy Noonan and Caitlyn Teetson will be each speaking for 20 to 25 minutes. I will introduce them, and then I will introduce our discussant, Barin Kayaoğlu, after which we will take questions. And as for the questions, I encourage the attendees to enter their questions into the Q&A function of Zoom. We will also take live questions if you prefer, but if you enter the questions ahead of time, that will allow us to coordinate, perhaps take multiple questions at one time. As for the idea for this, our 4th seminar in the Global Middle East series, the inspiration was to bring together 2 scholars, Timothy Noonan and Caitlyn Teetson, who are doing really interesting work on the international politics of the 1980s. And for those of you who signed up for a webinar with the words Iran, Iraq, and the 1980s in the title, you'll probably expect this to be about the Iran-Iraq War, Cold War alignments, realignments in the 1980s. But one of the reasons that I was excited to organize this particular event is that both Tim and Kate are doing new work that ties the international activities of Iranian and Iraqi men and women to domestic politics, to ideologies. And this is not to localize the story of the Iran-Iraq War, not to localize the story of international politics in the Middle East in the 1980s, but to think about the international perspective in different ways. And so both Tim and Kate have worked on Lebanon and North and East Africa And I hope that we'll be hearing about all of these things today. And to speak to this, we invited Barin Kayaoğlu, who was in Baghdad in the 1980s, but who has worked extensively on Iran as well. And I will introduce all of them a little bit more before they speak. For a title for the panel, we chose the post-Cold War Middle East. And this was a nod to the work of Lorenz Luthi, who we welcomed in the last event, who has argued that already in the 1970s, the Cold War as a international structure began to be less relevant in structuring the international politics of the Middle East. So this is something too that I hope we will hear a bit more about, perhaps in the discussion section at the end. But without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist. Timothy Noonan will be first. He received his DPhil in history at Oxford, and he is now lecturer in the Department of Global History at the Freie Universität of Berlin. I know his work best from his first book, Humanitarian Invasion, Global Development in Afghanistan, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2016. But he's now leading the Freigeist research group devoted to the history of Islamism during the Cold War. And it's this project about which he will be speaking about today. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Sam. Okay, great. Well, thank you to the Wilson Center and the Center for Russian Studies at Bilkent University for hosting me this evening. In particular, I'd like to thank Samuel Hurst for inviting me to speak, and I'm delighted to do so alongside Dr. Kate Teetson. I know that I've already learned much from watching the broadcasts at previous events this spring, such as the recent one with Lorenz Luthi, and so I hope to try to return the balance this evening. Observers of Iranian foreign policy were startled 2 weeks ago when 3 hours of an interview with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, never intended for public consumption, were leaked to the public. In the interview, Zarif described how the country's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, controlled nearly all aspects of the country's foreign policy. In particular, Zarif singled out the late IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani's role in dominating Iranian foreign policy moves in the Middle East. "I sacrificed diplomacy for the battlefield," Zarif said, using the latter term to refer to the IRGC under Soleimani. "In the Islamic Republic," he continued, "the battlefield rules." Put simply, the foreign minister no longer made foreign policy. The IRGC's pursuit of a Cold War strategy, as Zarif called it, prevented Iran from balancing its interests between the United States, Russia, and China. Zarif's interview highlights a number of key questions in the history of the Iranian Revolution, the history of the Cold War, and the relationship between the two. Which institutions in Iran control foreign policy? And how do struggles over control for foreign policy reflect domestic political battles? How did a state that claimed to overcome the Cold War end up pursuing a Cold War strategy itself? And more broadly, how ought we to situate the story of the Iranian revolutionary project alongside the history of the Cold War? In my remarks today, I want to provide a sample of my ongoing research on Islamist internationalism and the Cold War that I hope will provide some perspectives, if not always answers, to these questions. My research explores how Shia Islamist activists and intellectuals imagined an alternative to a world dominated by the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. It also explores the relationship between these Islamic activists and anti-colonial liberation movements in the Third World. Along the way, I've learned much from a history of ideas approach to these themes that focuses on Iranian intellectuals like Ali Shariati, who died before the Iranian Revolution. But my approach, in contrast, focuses on some of the institutions and activists who lived beyond the revolution and who made what they called an Islamic international, including the role of non-Iranians. Younger activists, like some of the people pictured on this slide, were some of the key drivers behind the Islamic Republic's outreach towards national liberation movements in the early 1980s. And my talk today will focus on the activities of Mohammad Motazeri, the son of a prominent Iranian Ayatollah, and Mohammad Saleh al-Husseini, an Iraqi exile who forged relations between Iranian Islamists and Palestinian groups in the 1970s. More specifically, I'll use one section from my ongoing book project to examine a project of these Islamic internationalists to enlist former Iraqi Baathists in the struggle against Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. And the most basic points I hope to communicate to you in my brief time today are two. The first is that Islamists were internationalists. Just as their enemies coordinated across borders, so too did Islamists seek to think and act globally. The second point is that actors like Motazeri, Husseini, and the Iraqis, to whom I'll introduce you shortly, saw themselves in a geopolitical problem space that may differ from some of our usual conceptions of the Cold War and its chronologies. For them, peaceful coexistence and détente had long signaled the end of the Cold War per se, and transformed the US-Soviet rivalry into mere neo-colonial competition. But at the same time, they saw themselves as capable of reviving the dream of an anti-colonial internationalism that China, India, Egypt, and others had long abandoned. But as my talk today shows, Islamism as a form of universalism would prove rife with the asymmetries and misunderstandings that had defined projects of socialism and anti-colonialism before it. Now, I'm sure we'll get to a lot of this in Q&A, but for the sake of time, I'll just sort of jump in. I think our starting point ought to be revolutionary Iran in the spring of 1979, after the Shah had left and the Ayatollah Khomeini had come back to revolutionary Iran. In the midst of the chaos, Iranian revolutionaries like Motazeri and al-Husseini, who had spent the 1970s in exile, returned to Tehran. Motazeri and al-Husseini had spent much of the decade in contact with the Palestinian group Fatah, as well as national liberation movements backed by Libya. Motazeri invited Palestinian officers to train Iranian militia groups, which subsequently formed part of the nascent IRGC. Motazeri also led the Unit for Liberation movements within the IRGC, one of several departments or units, alongside a unit for personnel, a unit for military training, and so on and so forth. The Unit for Liberation movements was less an organized institution, however, than a clearinghouse for the distribution of money, weapons, printing presses, and confiscated Tehran real estate to national liberation groups from around the world. In effect, the Unit for Liberation movements transferred the groups and experiences of solidarity networks that Libya had built in the 1970s to Tehran. Thus did groups like the Moro National Liberation Front from the Philippines, the Polisario movement from Western Sahara, and the Eritrean Liberation Movement from East Africa come to occupy office space in a central Tehran building alongside Iraqis, Afghans, Lebanese, Turks, and Gulf Arabs. As one Afghan recalled of the time, you could see any number of people, followers of every kind of belief and religion and tendency in the hallways of that building. Everyone from the Caribbean to the Far East was represented. The Unit for Liberation movements also had its own press organ, Islamic Ummah, or Ummat-e-Islami, that featured interviews with liberation movements from around the world. Notably, its pages championed the, quote, Syrian Mujahideen in their struggle against the Hafez Assad regime in Syria, depicted here as a Soviet marionette. The Unit for Liberation movements and its guests did not go unnoticed. As part of a book on the Moro National Liberation Front from the southern Philippines, for instance, an Iranian journalist interviewed the head of the group in its Tehran offices. Let into the Moro safe house, the journalist described meeting a man of medium height with a full face and smiling lips, and as usual, swarthy, with a coarse and penetrating, yet at the same time kind eyes. He had a pleasant demeanor, as if we had known one another for years. As the journalist inquired about the actual number of Muslims in the southern Philippines and the prospects for the region's economic independence, another Moro joined the conversation, a young man whose hair flowed down freely to his waist, short, with a trained and agile body. Interviews like these attest to the racialized fascination that movements from the Philippines, Eritrea, or Zaire held for the Iranian public in these early revolutionary years. The Unit for Liberation movements, however, also attracted criticism as a white elephant. One nationalist newspaper, Armani Millet, published this caricature of the Unit for Liberation movements as a waste of resource on distant strangers. In the graphic, a man foolishly transports water from a well across the desert to a band of revolutionaries on the horizon, doing so in a sieve. In this view, support for foreign revolutionaries was not an expression of the revolution's universalist potential, but simply a waste of money on foreigners, on stout bearded Arab men and Taubs, Gutras, and Agals on the horizon. So support for swarthy foreigners, often brown or Arab, could put the interests of strangers ahead of hardworking, mustachioed, masculine Iranians. Yet, to understand the Iranian Revolution's universal appeal, I think we need to look beyond just Iranian sources and understand how non-Iranian actors understood it at the time. And to do so, I want to introduce us to a central character in this section today, namely an Iraqi activist, Ayad Sabit. Born to a prominent family in Mosul in 1935, Sabit had been an early member of the Ba'ath Party. He opposed the 1958 Iraqi Revolution, led by Abdul Karim Qasim, and participated in the Mosul uprising that aimed to topple Qasim's rule. To the best that I can reconstruct, Sabit spent much of the 1960s in jail. After the Ba'ath Party's successful coup d'etat in 1968, however, he disagreed with other members of the Ba'ath Party and fled Iraq for Egypt and later Lebanon. Sabit wanted Arabs to overcome the Cold War, and he chastised the post-1968 Ba'ath Party as much as he had Qasim for turning Iraq into a dependency of the Soviet Union. The USSR, he wrote, had once had great effects on the revolutionary revival of the peoples of the Third World in general and the Arab homeland in particular. But Sabit regarded the Soviet theory of peaceful coexistence as a sellout of the revolution. It transformed Moscow into just another neo-colonial power. And now, both the USSR and the USA sought to dominate the Third World economically and politically. Sabit thus craved a leader who would stir the Arab masses, as he called them, and lead them to independence from the superpowers. In the context of the 60s, this made him a fan of Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. Following his death in 1970, Sabit turned to the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi as a potential substitute for these visions. But still, Sabit recognized that resource-rich but population-poor Libya lacked the gravity and the heft to lead a regional revolution. Sabit craved a revolutionary regime with the gravity and scale to realize his program of mass revolutionary politics. All of this Sabit laid out in his 1974 History of the Iraqi Revolution, when the revolutionary faces his fate, pictured on the left side of the slide and featuring his enemy, Qasim, on the cover. Given these priors, Sabit perceived the Iranian Revolution as a revival of the Nasserist and to some extent Gaddafiist dream. Motazeri and al-Husseini met with Sabit in Damascus and Beirut several times in 1978 and 1979. And sometime, probably in the summer or fall of 1979, Sabit traveled to revolutionary Tehran. And there he was struck by the revolutionary asceticism and enthusiasm of the Unit for Liberation movements. Our 5-day visit, he wrote, left excitement in our souls. We found them to represent a surprising kind of revolutionaries, infinite in their simplicity, unimaginable in their modesty, simple in their way of living, with much chaos in everything. They work day and night without fatigue or boredom. They eat simple food when they're hungry and sleep on the floor when they're tired. And yet, in a sign of institutional rivalry already budding in Tehran, Sabit noted that Motazeri, the leader of the Unit for Liberation movements, could not yet provide him with an Iranian passport. Motazeri's pockets overflow with various stamps and stickers that Sabit could put into his passport or the foreign passports of other guests. But the issuing of Iranian passports remained in the hands of what Sabit saw as the pro-American foreign ministry. Geopolitics soon provided Sabit, Motazeri, and al-Husseini to collaborate more closely. On September 22, 1980, the Iraqi military invaded Iran. The invasion forced the Iranian regime to redirect attention and resources from Third World liberation movements to the Iranian homeland. But these new priorities offered Motazeri, al-Husseini, and others in the IRGC to develop new plans for a quisling or marionette regime in Baghdad. To do so, they reached out to Sabit. In early October 1980, Sabit, several IRGC commanders, the Ayatollah Khomeini's son, Ahmad, and Iraqi Kurdish dissidents met together at the Bab al-Azia Palace in Tripoli, Libya. There, they met with Muammar Gaddafi to discuss the logistics for Sabit and his band of some 300 Ba'athist dissidents. The Iranians, Libyans, and Iraqis agreed to champion Sabit as a replacement for Saddam Hussein. But already in the meeting in Libya, Sabit sensed tension with his hosts. Was the goal to establish an Islamic republic in Shia-majority southern Iraq, or to maintain Iraq as a united country of Arab Sunni, Arab Shia, Kurds, and other minorities? Sabit rejected the idea that a successful mass uprising in Iraq, his vision, would culminate in Iraq's, quote, accession to the mother revolution in Iran. The rhetoric of Islamic revolution promised to be universal, but Sabit noticed in some of his Iranian hosts, and Ahmad Khomeini in particular, a hint of national chauvinism. All the same, by the end of October 1980, Sabit and his band of revolutionaries arrived in Tehran. They were resettled into the expropriated mansion of Iranian Jews who had fled into exile. And on December 29th, 1980, Motazeri and al-Husseini convened a press conference for Sabit's forces. They presented themselves as the, quote, revolutionary Islamic forces for the liberation of Iraq. As Sabit understood it, his men would be supplied money, weapons, radio stations, and press equipment from Kurdistan in the north to the end of the Shatt al-Arab in the south, from which factions would fulfill the tasks assigned to them to revolutionize our Iraqi masses. In Sabit's view, the Ba'athist regime was a house of cards that would succumb to mass uprisings if only the masses could hear his message. Yet, Sabit's assignment proved very different from what he had imagined. As Sabit held his press conference, the Iranian city of Khorramshahr had fallen to Iraqi forces. Other major Iranian population centers along the Western Front, like Kermanshah, Dezful, Ahvaz, and Abadan, remained under Iranian control. But while the Iranians had resisted the worst, tens of thousands of square miles of their territory remained under occupation, and no significant wealthy nations supported their efforts. The Iranians needed all of the help they could get to liberate their own territory and press forward against the Iraqis. So, Sabit's men were deployed to Gilan-e-Garb, a part of Kermanshah province in western Iran, the top circle on the slide here. But upon arriving in Gilan-e-Garb, Sabit encountered a warscape in which the Iranian and Iraqi armies were pounding one another with artillery across a 5-kilometer wide no man's land. IRGC commanders in the region denied Sabit the ability to operate independently, and the best plan they could come up with was for his men to disguise themselves in Iraqi military uniforms, walk across the no man's land, incite revolution, and then walk back across the border into Iran. Little thought had seemingly been given to the fact that neither Sabit nor his men spoke Persian and were almost certain to be mowed down by Iranian defenders in the latter part of this plan. So Sabit's men instead engaged in trench combat alongside the IRGC against the Iraqi army, losing 4 men in battles in February and March 1981. But Sabit hadn't signed up for being bombarded by Soviet-made artillery. He grumbled that the Arabic and Persian language press in the Islamic Republic of Iran did not report on his exploits. Instead, he noted, other Iraqi opposition groups were content to sit in their mansions and hotels in Tehran, issue statements, and let others, like him, do the fighting. As Sabit saw things, the United States was preparing to abandon Saddam Hussein for a new government, one headed by the Shia cleric Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim and the former army officer Hassan Mustafa al-Nakib, as a concession to the military and Iraq's Sunni population. Like Motazeri, Sabit saw the Soviet Union as a totally exhausted superpower, an ethnic Russian state that used proletarian internationalism as a flimsy cover for its geopolitical ambitions. The United States, in contrast, was a dynamic enemy, ready to find pseudo-Islamist clients to bottle up authentically anti-American states like Iran or Libya. Sabit's fear of Iraqi rivals in the Islamic Republic turned out to be justified. Sabit returned from the front to Tehran, but there, Motazeri, the leader of the Unit for Liberation Movements, informed him that other elements in the IRGC had begun to denounce him as an alcoholic, an atheist, and a gambler. Former IRGC commander Mohsen Rafik Doust described in his memoirs how Sabit's headquarters in Tehran overflowed with hard liquor. And Sabit himself describes receiving reports through Rafik Doust from Iranian military intelligence that denounced him as a Ba'athist and atheist who sought to undermine the, quote, Islamic solution envisioned for Iraq. Finally, by June 1981, Sabit and his men were unceremoniously deported from the Islamic Republic of Iran. In Sabit's view, elements even within the IRGC had been co-opted by American influence and were in effect supporting now a pro-American but still Islamist regime in Baghdad. Sabit would leave Tehran for Damascus, skeptical of the prospects for liberation movements anywhere in the Third World, not just Iraq. Foreign patronage, he wrote, inevitably corrupted liberation movements. Up until the masses seizure of power, he wrote, the revolution is in constant need of financial resources. But sources of funding, especially in our Arab world, are rarely national, let alone revolutionary. Sabat admitted to having been naive that the Iranian revolutionaries would deviate from this iron rule of international politics. He had, he wrote, wanted to believe in a universal revolutionary project, but seen from his newfound exile, the prospects now seemed bleak. When placed in the correct framework, free of political diseases, regional deviations, chauvinistic bumps, and sectarian or racial intolerance, human energies can explode in an amazing way without limits, he wrote. But in practice, the people of the third world have grown used to thinking that they have no chance at realizing any gain in life unless they suffer from the exact same disease as others. Sunnis worked with Sunnis, Shia with Shia, Druze with Druze, and Alawites with Alawites. Sabat's departure from the Islamic Republic of Iran also dovetailed with the decline in influence of Islamist internationalists on the foreign policy of the regime. On March 5th, 1981, the Iraqi activist Mohammad Saleh al-Husseini, again a crucial mediator between the Khomeiniist movement and Palestinian groups in Lebanon, was gunned down outside of the Iranian embassy in Beirut, probably, but perhaps not certainly, by Iraqi intelligence. Some 3 months later, Mohammad Motazeri and many of the leading figures in the early Islamic Republic were killed when a bomb exploded during a meeting of the Islamic Republic Party. As you can see in these images here, Fatah, the Palestinian group, memorialized both men in posters and advertisements in Iranian Arabic language media. As Arab journalists saw it, men like Husseini and Motazeri represented an Arab current, the Tayyar Arabi, fluent in the language of the Palestinian Revolution and able to connect with non-Shia revolutionary movements in the Arab world and perhaps further afield. Their elimination, together with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon a year later in 1982, would sever many of these connections. The deaths of al-Husseini and Motazeri contributed to a winding up of the institutions of Islamist internationalism. When the IRGC's charter was reaffirmed by the Iranian Majlis in the autumn of 1982, for instance, it no longer included the Unit for Liberation movements. Many of the resources and institutions that had been under the unit's auspices were moved to seminaries in Qom and Esfahan in early 1983. But the trend was clear. Tehran continued to support Iraqi Islamist groups, but it did so through a Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, not former Baathists like Sabat. And it supported Hezbollah through its relations with Syria. Liberation movements from the Moro that we saw earlier to SWAPO, the liberation movement in what is today Namibia, would remain in Tehran throughout the 1980s, but they no longer occupied the privileged place in Iranian diplomacy that they had a few months or years earlier. So let me zoom out for a moment to offer a couple of conclusions before handing off to Dr. Teetson. Firstly, the story of Sabat, Motazeri, and the Unit for Liberation movements, I think, enriches how we can understand the relationship of Islamism and the Cold War. The best scholarly treatments of the Cold War, in my view, like those by Arnie Westad, Paul Chamberlain, and Lawrence Luthi, often present Islamism as a particularistic ideology that still eroded the prospects for the left in countries like Iran, Afghanistan, and Lebanon. And yet, figures like Motazeri or Sabat would have taken issue with the notion that their ideology was not universalistic. Publications close to the Unit for Liberation movements criticized the blind spots of supposedly universalistic Western human rights ideology, for turning a blind eye to the massacres of Palestinian refugee camps in the Lebanese civil war, for instance. And more broadly, actors like Sabat, who moved from Baathism to some kind of Nasserist position to what you might call Islamism, blur the ideological boundaries and the categories that I think we've become familiar and used to for having these debates. More broadly still, instead of critiquing whether an ideology is really universal from an etic or even an emic perspective, I think we need to pay attention to how these actors square their aspirations of universalism with the reality of national, linguistic, and confessional difference. I focused on Sabat today, but in my work, I'm especially interested in seeing how groups with different backgrounds, with different ideological priors, squared their hopes about the Islamic Revolution with the reality of the 1980s. Whether Afghans, Turks, Lebanese, or Iraqi Islamists, the story of conversion, of disappointment, of disillusionment was very different. And it's understanding that process rather than saying from the outside that something is actually universalistic or actually particularistic that I think is really rich. Secondly, though, to come back to the leaked interview with Mohammad Javad Zarif that I began my remarks with today, I'd like to emphasize that there was nothing inevitable about the ultimate foreign policy constellation that the Islamic Republic or the IRGC took following the Iranian Revolution. Internationalists like Motazeri saw Iran's future as much more in line with Fatah or Libya than they did with Syria. Their vision for the unit for liberation movements reflected the idea that the Islamic Republic could maintain relations with both states as well as transnational liberation movements without contradiction. Events like the 1980 Iraqi invasion, the June 1981 bombings, and the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, however, channeled the Islamic Republic and the IRGC into the direction of militarization and partnership with Syria and the Lebanese groups that became Hezbollah. To make the case most plainly or most provocatively, I think that instead of focusing on 1979 per se, we might instead think more productively of a longer period from 78 or 79 to 82 as a kind of Sattelzeit, a longer transition period of the late Cold War and the modern Middle East. Finally, the sources for how we might unpack this history are increasingly available, as I hope to have shown today through Sabit's memoirs and the allusion to books like Rafik Just's Oral History Project. But if we're honest, we have to note that these sources are often asymmetric in terms of quality, type, and scale. I first came across the story of Sabit while reading the oral history interviews with Mohsen Rafik Dust, pictured on the left and who participated in an official oral history project similar to the one that produced the leaked tape of Zarif. This in turn led me to Sabit's memoirs and his other books in Arabic. Yet, it's worth noting that Sabit's memoirs were not published with an ordinary publisher somewhere in the Arab world, but rather with the IRGC's Kermanshah branch, or with the evident intent of slandering other people in the Iranian regime. And in particular, they were aimed at this other person, Mehdi Hashemi, who inherited a lot of the resources of the Unit for Liberation Movements. In contrast to Motazeri, who the book frames as sort of a good internationalist, for instance, the introduction of the book attacks Hashemi as somebody who represents, quote, the living and dangerous examples of qualities like populism, chauvinism, and sectarian fanaticism, all dressed in the cover of religion. So like the Zarif leaks today in 2021, Sabit's memoirs are also a weaponization of history to take down internal enemies inside of Iran. The charges of particularism, sectarianism, and chauvinism always remain in the quill of those who claim to speak in the name of the universal. So sources like these aren't clean. They're dirty in some sense. They come with agendas and they compete with one another across the divides of 40 years of history. But the challenge for historians like us remains of how to integrate these sources alongside state archives like the Ba'ath Party archives or recently opening Turkish Foreign Ministry archives, and this not to mention American or Soviet sources. It's my hope that between my remarks and Dr. Teetson's contribution that we might spur a discussion of the promises and the pitfalls of writing history across these asymmetrical source bases. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Tim. Couldn't have asked for something better for a Global Middle East series. Our next speaker is Caitlyn Teetson, who received her PhD in history at Kansas State University. Her PhD dissertation was on the Iraqi quest for autonomy through military and diplomatic interventions, 1968 to 2003. She is now based at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, where she is working on the U.S. military's Operation Iraqi Freedom. Kate, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you, Tim. A lot of stuff that Tim just talked about there really touches upon some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today. And I also want to thank Sam again for organizing this and herding the cats, so to speak. I know this was pretty, we had time zone changes and all that fun stuff. So thank you so much for organizing this, and I'm excited to be part of this great panel. I also need to quickly state that the following presentation does not represent the United States Department of Defense or the United States Army, and that these are my views and my views alone. So in this presentation today, I'm going to be talking about Iraq in the 1980s. However, I think there needs to be a little bit of background on the country, especially since we're talking about the Cold War, how this affected Iraq. And I think this really helps lay the groundwork for Iraq in the 1990s. And I will defer to the Q&A section and our discussion section more about the 1990s, but I do want to focus a little bit on the 1980s here as well. So generally speaking, the usual historiography for Iraq during the Cold War is that it was in a typical client-patron relationship with the Soviet Union. Despite all the chaos of the coups in the 1960s in Iraq after the fall of the Iraqi monarchy in 1958, the Soviets were eager and patient, and they actually sought to resume relations with the Iraqis more so than the Americans. And of course, there are elements of tapping into pan-Arabism, anti-colonialism. The Americans, by and large, didn't really trust these new regimes. And in American documents, we see they're like, all right, how long will this group last for? And really didn't want to devote any time or resources to just to lose that again. By 1968, the Ba'ath Party comes into power, and the Americans, again, are not quite sure how long this group would survive, but the Soviets jump back in, and by 1972, these two countries have signed a friendship and cooperation pact. The Soviets begin deploying military and political advisors to Baghdad, and the two enter into economic agreements as well. But this relationship was testy at best. The Soviets are also trying to court the Syrians, much to Iraq's displeasure, given the fact that the Ba'athist Party at this time had bitterly split into the Syrian faction and to the Iraqi faction. There's documents that I have found in the Ba'ath records at Hoover where the Iraqis are celebrating the fact that the Soviets have cut off the Syrians after the Yom Kippur War, and so the Syrians in retaliation go to the Chinese instead, and the Soviets are scrambling to cut off that, and the Iraqi intelligence is basically laughing. They're totally enjoying this mess. There's also a belief in Iraq that the Soviets were they were waiting for Iran to open up as they sensed Soviet enthusiasm for the turmoil in Tehran. This is not to say that the Iraqis weren't unhappy with the deteriorating situation in Iran, as they definitely took pleasure in the Shah's troubles, but they feared that the Soviets would forsake Iraq and give greater importance to Iran after the US-backed regime fell. It also did not help that the Iraqis had their own sense of autonomy, something that the Soviets neither respected nor welcomed. For one, and we'll talk about this a bit more in this presentation, the Iraqis often acted first and then informed the Soviets later. There, of course, is the famous example of the September 1980 invasion of Iran. The Iraqis did not tell the Soviets, did not notify them ahead of time. Saddam Hussein he's angry that the Soviets were not happy with the invasion, believing that he did not need to seek the permission nor their blessing for their action. Frustrated with the surprise, the Kremlin does not endorse the invasion, and we have documents where Saddam is just incredulous that the Soviets would not support him. At the same time, too, though, domestically, the Baathists had been moving on the Iraqi Communist Party and basically had murdered those leaders and even made it punishable by death if you join the Iraqi Communist Party. And the Soviets don't really do much. I mean, there's the typical diplomatic, like, hey, don't do that. We don't support that. But there's way more, there's not as much stick as there is carrot in this situation. Furthermore, Iraqi actions and conduct in the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe often went against Soviet interests. And so, for example, and this is the bulk of the presentation a little bit here, the Iraqis were using their embassies in the Eastern Bloc to conduct intelligence operations and other nefarious activities. In countries like East Germany, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, Iraqi agents were deployed to beat up, kidnap, murder, assassinate political dissidents, expatriates, communists, and other perceived threats to the state. There's even one case in Czechoslovakia where the Iraqi ambassador's car was spotted by Czechoslovakian intelligence at a communist rally, where Iraqi thugs were sent to beat up Iraqi communists in the crowd. And we have documents where Saddam Hussein is signing off on paying for the medical treatment for the Iraqi thugs, the goons who got beat up themselves. The Soviets were furious at this. They thought the Iraqis were drawing way too much attention to themselves. The Iraqis are doing this, like I said, in East Germany and Bulgaria, and their respective intelligence agencies are writing to Moscow going, what do we do? Baghdad in return only accelerates these things and accelerates these activities. Generally in US military circles, and I'm being very broad here, the 1980s for Iraq is examined through the Iran-Iraq War, which leads to First Gulf, with the August 19 invasion of Kuwait, which then leads to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. But what I'm trying to show in this presentation that Iran and the war with Iran and the relationship with the Soviets is just part of this era. The documents that were controversially captured and brought to the United States after Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, the Ba'ath Party records at the Hoover Institution, and then the conflict records, which were used to be housed by the Pentagon, are giving us better insights into the regime. My argument here is that Iraqi foreign policy, which to this I'm including diplomatic overtures, military objectives, was about simultaneously expanding Iraqi national interests and securing the Ba'ath Party apparatus. These endeavors in the 1980s laid the groundwork for the 1990s, in which the Iraqis maneuvered in a new era of American hegemony. And again, in US military circles, there's this gap of like, all right, first Gulf, we defeated the Iraqis, nothing, some sanctions, and then 2003. But the Iraqi political operations in the 1990s were broad. They infiltrated almost everything. And the base of this really starts in the 1980s. So we need to go back to the 1970s, Vic. And like Tim alluded to, 1979 was a crucial year for Iraqi and Iranian history. In 1979, Saddam officially ascends to the presidency, although he had long been operating in the shadows. And he comes to power in the midst of the Iranian Revolution. The overthrow of the Shah and the new Iranian theocratic regime sets off alarm bells in Baghdad. And so subsequent Iraqi foreign policy was dictating on countering and neutralizing threats, some real, some not. And there's a lot of conspiratorial seeing shadows when they're not really there in Iraqi foreign policy. This includes the Shia, but in Ba'athist documents, they're not called Shia, they're called Persians. And diplomats who refer to the Shia as Shia get reprimanded and crossed out and say, no, it's Persian, it's Persian. Expatriates, the Israelis, which they're called the Zionists, you rarely see Israelis in Iraqi documents, former Ba'athists, etc. The history and legacy of coups are also important here. Saddam and the party elite were driven to secure their position in the party. They were wary of any threats, whether it be from their own party or whether it's from their own military. And so this sense of paranoia drove a lot of Iraqi foreign policy, and therefore military action and diplomacy were subverted to the will of the party. And this occurred at the same time in Baghdad, but also abroad. In the 1980s, Iraqi embassies housed institutions that would become embassy organizations. Essentially, these were centers for intelligence gathering and avenues for obtaining soft power. What we see in the 1980s is that student unions, women's groups, peace organizations, etc., were all monitored and in some cases infiltrated by the Iraqis. In some cases, these groups were stood up as a student group in England, for example, and it seemed that it's completely separate from Iraqi foreign policy, the Ba'athist party, but it's the strings are there, and the Iraqis try to come across as if they are standalone. There's no coordination, but a lot of like the media statements, policy action is all dictated by those in Baghdad. By the end of the decade, Iraqi embassy organizations operated in 69 countries. And so Iraqi operatives attended lectures by Iraqi dissidents in the United States. They visited campuses, including Ivy League campuses, as well as state schools. And these organizations not only infiltrated soft power groups, but they also monitored political and media activities in their respective nations. These groups would become extremely important in the 1990s as, again, Iraq moved to undermine the Americans and United Nations sanctions, excuse me. And again, I will defer to Q&A for that. Institutions like the embassy organizations demonstrate the Ba'ath Party's intent to secure its status abroad. So it's not just about cementing its legacy and its power in Iraq, it's also abroad. And so this signals further attempts by the party to control all aspects and information regarding the Iraqi people and the state. In 1982, Iraqis living abroad began reporting to the Ba'athist Party. And what I mean by this is, so if you're an Iraqi family that immigrated to France, you would report your status to the Iraqi embassy in Paris. This information was then channeled to the Ba'ath Party, not the diplomatic channels, and thus it creates like two parallel foreign policy institutions. You have the Ba'athists, and then you have the equivalent to the career civil servants. In the Iraqi documents, it's clear there's a lot of distrust between the two of them. And unfortunately for the civil servants, the Ba'ath Party members often won the disputes. The Ba'athist Party bureaucracy was expanding and become more and more complicated and more ingratiated with Iraqi foreign embassies. Essentially, party members acted as spies and they reported on their fellow countrymen. They meddled in the daily affairs in the embassy, and their positions often gave them the sense of impunity. There's documents in the Ba'ath records of embassy elections in the 1990s in Poland, for example, just after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so they're delegating who gets what position, who's in charge of what, and it's actually an election. Well, the Ba'athist party member in the embassy basically throws out the election, says this was unfair, and he puts his cronies in charge instead and says this is what Baghdad wants. And those career civil servants can't really say much. They'll be reported on. And so it doesn't help, and we can talk about this in Q&A too, that it doesn't help that there are some Ba'athist party members who in the Soviet Union, for example, there's one who get into trouble. And for one example, I believe it was 1992 or 1993, the Iraqi ambassador to Moscow gets drunk with his driver, and they end up getting into a shootout with Moscow police, and this whole thing happens. And the career civil servants are eager to turn on him, start reporting that he was basically having relationships with female Iraqi students who were in the country. He's recalled to Baghdad. I lose track of him in the documents. I don't know what officially happened, but one could take a guess. So anyways, there are two cases in the 1980s that I want to look at today that illustrate the broad scope of Iraqi operations abroad. The key here is that Iran is not the sole focus of Iraqi foreign and military policy at this time. This can't be compared to the United States in World War II, where the state and society is completely devoted to defeating the Nazis and the Japanese. Rather, the 1980s, the Iraqis expended an extraordinary amount of time and effort in securing a party apparatus abroad, and then exploring that party's control abroad as well. So the first case is Lebanon. Iraqi involvement in Lebanon began with the Lebanese Civil War in 1975, 1976. Publicly, Baghdad proclaimed it was stopping Syrian expansion into Lebanon, and it wanted to inflict damage on the Zionists. And that's a big thing, is stopping the Israelis. However, the military contribution to Lebanon is way more talk than walk. 500 volunteers, and we're talking about what these volunteers mean, were sent as an aid delegation in 1976, and then another 500 members were sent as part of the 32nd Special Forces Brigade in 1978. But these deployments were neither consistent nor sustainable, as they relied on Syrian border crossings, which weren't exactly easy to obtain because the Iraqis, again, are famous for pointing fingers. They criticized the Syrians for cutting off water sources, and then they asked to cross the border, and the Syrians say no, and the Iraqis are clearly, you don't want to defend us against the Israelis. How Arab are you? And so, like, the Iraqis are fantastic at starting fights, and then realizing that they basically have gone a little too far. And at the same time, the Iraqi military has very limited resources for this. They don't even have maps of the region. And so a lot of this is more talk than walk. But what is important is that a large number of Iraqis that were deployed to this conflict in the 1970s and through the 1980s were members of the Popular Army. This essentially was a shadow military created and controlled by the Ba'ath Party outside the Iraqi military structure. Party members who had displeased their bosses or the elite were sent to Lebanon to, quote, fulfill their national mission, which was to defend Lebanon from Israel and Syria, and then to bring prestige to Iraq. In reality, the creation of the Popular Army was all about coup-proofing and protecting the Ba'ath Party, but these deployments tested your loyalty to the party. If you didn't go, you lost access to the party, and you could face jail or even execution. There are military commanders who are executed. Volunteers, as they were referred to, and not volunteer in the sense that they had a choice for this, who did not perform their national mission according to Ba'athist Party standards. And there really isn't a common standard that they could point to and say, this is how you achieve your national mission. It basically was left to the whims of those in the field, were threatened, and in some cases deployed to the front of the war against Iran. So you had a choice. You could go to Lebanon, see if you survive that, see if you appease your bosses there, or go to Iran, which your chances were not so good. These national missions occurred between 1976 and 1978, and as well as in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon. In the context of the Iran-Iraq War, Lebanon served as a way for the party to exert control over its members and to secure its future. The civil war was useful for Iraqis. They could be legitimate defenders of Lebanon and Palestine with very limited military effort. while also threatening and coercing further acquiescence in the party. Our second case looks outside the Middle East into the Horn of Africa. Along with access to the Red Sea, the Iraqis were interested about what the Soviets and the Americans are doing in the region. And in a sense, they're keeping up with the Joneses. They're, in a lot of cases, the Iraqis write back, like, the Americans are interested in this port, send people down here, find out what they're doing, with very limited understanding of what's actually going on. Attention was given to Sudan, Kenya, Eritrea, among many others. Now, so let's examine Iraqi initiatives in Eritrea, for example. What is now modern day Eritrea was in the midst of a war with Ethiopia as it was trying to break away. Baathists in this region argue it would be an opportune time to spread Iraqi influence in the region. So notice that this is Iraqi Baathists who are writing this. These aren't career civil servants who are saying this is a good time to get involved. But the conflict was so complicated with so many different ethnic groups, rival groups, that the Iraqis had trouble keeping up with the specifics. Even like reading through it, these documents, I'm like, who are they talking about? And I don't think these Baathists understood themselves. In some cases, the Baathists tried to organize meetings and conferences in Iraq and in the region with these various Eritrean groups, only to find that these Eritrean groups would take it upon themselves to cut off the Iraqis. They would take Iraqi money and Iraqi, assistance, whatever that may be, and then just disappear. And so it would lead these Baathists to have to write back that they've achieved success in the region, but there's not quite clear what the success is if your conference collapsed before it even began. And so the Iraqis also really couldn't fund this project in its entirety, given its war with Iran. And there are a lot of Baathist financial requests are left unheeded because, again, the war with Iran takes precedent. Was this area that important, or did bureaucrats make it out to be? I think the latter is the case. The Iraqi documents suggest that the Baath party was more concerned with and preoccupied really with exporting Baathist ideology in the region, and believed that the civil war would allow them to do so. Rebel groups and student groups that did not succeed were inherently chastised of, well, clearly they didn't follow the Baathist ideals, that's why they were crushed on the battlefield. Never mind that we didn't give them any weapons or arms to help them. And so the ideology becomes a way of gauging success. And if you succeeded, you must have therefore, read all the writings of Saddam Hussein about Baathism. If you didn't, then clearly you aren't a true Baathist at heart. But this is a perfect example in Eritrea of the desire to spread party ideology and how that blurred the realities on the ground. And this happens quite a bit. This isn't just in Eritrea. There are the instances going through the Hoover documents, like, why are the Iraqis there? And usually it's because some Baathist party member has made it to be more important than it actually is. And the Iraqis, the Saddam Hussein regime becomes obsessed with this, of exporting Baathist influence abroad. And not all these instances are successful. In some cases are quite embarrassing. Eritrea is just one of these many examples. And despite being engulfed in a war with its neighbor, a war that saw chemical weapons usage and other horrors, the Iraqis still found themselves bogged down in a lot of these complicated adventures, if you will. And many of these proved fruitless. But this is just one of the examples of where Iraqi foreign policy reached. This is how far they got into. Not even the Americans were that involved in Eritrea. And there's documents from the Carter administration, and I'm sure when more President Reagan's documents are released by the State Department, you're going to see like the Carter administration's like, what are the Iraqis doing there? And so this just kind of symbolizes that the Iraqis are willing to get involved in there. Are their methods sound? Is spreading ideology probably the number one way of achieving influence? That's how they saw it, though. But because you had parallel institutions in these embassy organizations where the party trumps the civil servants, not all the success is going to come to them that what they were looking for. So I'm going to wrap up here. I know this presentation was a little short on the shorter end because I wanted to leave this more for discussion and Q&A about the 1990s as well. What I want to reiterate here, though, is that in the 1980s, Iraq was busy. It had many different hands and many different cookie jars, so to speak. Managing the war with Iran and the relationship with the Soviets were only part of the agenda. And I have barely seen any reference to Cold War, quote unquote, in Baathist documents. For them, it is expanding Iraqi autonomy abroad, and securing its party at home and abroad, and making sure that Iraqi foreign institutions are being controlled by the Ba'athist party, but also espousing Ba'athism. Iraqi foreign policy and military policy therefore become intertwined with the Ba'athist party's desire to secure its status and its influence abroad. And by the 1990s, you cannot separate the two of them. So I'm going to wrap up there. I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Kate, and to the guest appearance from your cats. Kate, you said that I had to work to herd the cats, and in fact, I had a very easy job because your presentation just now, as did Tim's, speaks so well to the issues that we're interested in this Global Middle East series. And I look forward to the comments from our discussants. Barin Kayaoğlu received his PhD in history from the University of Virginia, where he wrote a dissertation, Loving and Hating America in Turkey and Iran, a Cold War story of alliance politics and authoritarian modernization, 1945 to 1980. He's now Dean of Students and Assistant Professor of World History at the American University of Iraq in Soleimani. And he's working on a book that draws on that, or finishing a book on that draws on that dissertation. And Barin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sam. I would like to begin by thanking these wonderful scholars for sharing their research with us. I thoroughly enjoyed reading their notes and listening to their presentations. I'd also like to thank once again the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project, as well as my alma mater, Bilkent University's Center for Russian Studies. It's so nice to be hanging out with you folks in this pandemic, no matter how virtual. Let's see. As I was reading the notes, before I continue, I should also make a quick disclaimer, like the one Dr. Teetson did, because I'm an administrator at the American University of Iraq, Soleimani, but I'm also a professor, and my academic freedoms are completely respected here, but I still feel the urge to say that none of the things I'm going to say here our views are shared by my employer, AUIS. They're my personal views alone. Let's see, I wrote, while I was going through the presentations this afternoon and listening to the presentation, their research notes, and listening to these fine presentations this afternoon, I kept thinking about Billy Joel's wonderful work on the Cold War, We Didn't Start the Fire, where it specifically touches on this period. Begin, Reagan, Palestine, terror on the airline, Ayatollahs in Iran, Russians in Afghanistan. Now, in the Global Middle East seminar series so far, we've actually touched upon a lot of these topics, but there has been, I find, a tension between two things. And I would say that Timothy's conclusion really brought this out, and much of Kate's presentation, again, her conclusion really brought this out. Are we talking about the global Cold War in the Middle East, or are we just talking about internal dynamics? And good global history usually tries to have it both ways. And I would actually say that these two research projects, while they're specifically focusing on Iran and Iraq, and also questioning whether this was really about the Cold War, still bring in a lot of Cold War dynamics and Cold War tensions into their work. I'd like to draw a couple of examples and not take too much time. Hopefully I'll be able to wrap everything up in 10, 15 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for the Q&A. For example, Timothy started off with the strategic leaks to be used against Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif. One of the things I was struck by when those leaks came out was Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, saying, oh, well, this doesn't really matter. Mr. Zarif is wrong, Dr. Zarif is wrong, because the foreign ministry has never made foreign policy since the revolution. And that was also, by and large, true during the time of the Shah. There were some extremely important, influential policy makers, but they had to be directly plugged in with the Shah. The most prominent example being Ambassador Ardeshir Zahidi, who served as ambassador to Washington twice, as foreign minister, and arguably he had more influence in making foreign policy because he was at one time married, I believe, either to the Shah's sister or to his daughter. So he had the Shah's voice. He had the Shah's ear, and the throne, the Pahlavi court, was really where foreign policy was decided. And eventually, after the revolution, a lot of this also came out. One of the fascinating things I find about Iranian foreign policy, as a student of modern Iranian history myself, is that there's always, and once I get to Kate's topic, I'm also going to touch upon this, is how politics and international relations are conceived at three different levels, but with very close connections between them. At one level, thank you, Hamza O'Brien. Yes, he was married. Ardeshir Zahidi was married to the Shah's daughter. You have the local, the domestic level, where the regimes are trying to consolidate themselves. That was the case with the Shah's regime. That would be the case with Islamic revolutionaries, even today, with the Islamic regime in Tehran. You also have the Baathists, who are, even for a new country like Iraq, are themselves a very, very new bunch who suddenly find themselves thrust in decision making, and they're extremely insecure, and for good measure, because they're not that popular. So they start to pursue some regional agendas. In the case of Saddam in 1980, the most prominent example, the most visible example, is his decision to attack Iran, hopefully also to topple the regime, the new Islamic regime in Tehran, and then to earn a lot of brownie points with his Western partners, possibly the Soviets as well, because there's a conception that the revolution in Iran would also threaten Soviet interests through influencing Muslim republics in Soviet Central Asia and in the Caucasus, and that doesn't really pan out. But so you have the domestic / internal, you have the regional approach, and you have the international vision, which, by the way, also the Shah had. He would use the language of the third world. He would use the language of Iran, setting itself as an example of development, of modernization to the rest of the world, and eventually to use its oil wealth to improve the lot of the disfortunate around the world. And of course, the case of the Islamic Revolution, you mentioned Ali Shariati, that's exactly the vision that the Islamic Revolution and the cadres of the Islamic Revolution who rise to power very much share that. They, of course, put a very strong Islamic lens on that, on that vision of Iran influencing world events in a positive direction, but through the prism of Islamic solidarity. Let's see. I took too many notes, and now I don't want to lose my cogency. Which so let's briefly, before we move on to Iraq, one of the things I really like Timothy mentioning is how the Islamic Revolution in Iran inspired Islamic thinkers and political Islamists in other Muslim countries. In my native Turkey, for example, there are three big thinkers, international thinkers, non-Turkish thinkers, who inspired the Islamic, political Islamic movement and the cadres in Turkey in the 60s and 70s. Ali Shariati is one prominent example, but also Maulana Maududi from Pakistan, and of course, Sayyid Qutb from Egypt. These folks, and the success of the Islamic Revolution in Iran really elevates the thinking of Turkish Islamists, and they start thinking how they also can come to power, and eventually in a morphed way through the political processes rather than a violent Islamic revolution. They do come to power in Turkey. So it's that notion that Iran, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, has something to teach for the Muslim world is very true, and it does play out. in certain Muslim countries eventually. Very briefly, again, terrific to coming to Kate's discussion. Again, you know, terrific work. I know you wanted to more talk about Iraq, but in the background, the Cold War is very much there. You know, in terms of the Iraq-USSR partnership in 1972 becoming official, which, by the way, was by and large itself a response on the part of both the Soviets and the Iraqis of fear to the Shah's rise and his seemingly unstoppable rise to regional superpower status in the early 1970s and in the middle of the 1970s. Meanwhile, there are frictions emerging in the 70s and the late 70s between Syria and Iraq. You would think that these two Arab nationalists, these Ba'athist regimes, Arab socialist regimes would, you know, play ball together. They're having extremely serious friction and fissures among them. And much like in Iran with the revolutionaries, but although the Shah, and likewise with the going back to the Shah's regime, the Ba'ath regime in Iraq also is operating at three different levels. They're pursuing domestic survival, consolidation. Much of what they do in the region and around the world is meant to serve that purpose. At home, the Ba'ath regime starts to clamp down on all forms of opposition, on Kurds and communists in particular. Regionally, of course, Saddam thinks that he's found a golden opportunity to strike at Iran in 1980. One of the things I'm fascinated by the way, during this period is in April 1980, there's a coup attempt in Iran by elements of the Iranian military against the Islamic regime. And there's every indication to suggest that some elements of this coup attempt may have been backed by Baghdad. I haven't done any serious research on this, but it goes to show that even before Saddam woke up one summer morning and decided to attack Iran and to reclaim what he saw as ethnic Arab lands in southwest Iran, there was an attempt constantly to undermine this regional rival. And of course, there is that international international sense of mission that Saddam will, regional and international sense of mission that Saddam will ascribe to himself as the 1980s went on. A large part of it was about the Iran war. He would come to see himself and his regime as a defender of Arabs, not only against, of course, the Zionists or even the Iranians, but against everyone. And he would force the Saudis and the Kuwaitis to bankroll his war against Iran, which ultimately would sow the seeds of his invasion in 1990 of Kuwait. So one of the fascinating things, of course, in the case of Iraq, and we haven't been able to go into this, I'm in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, right? This three-level approach to politics, to domestic politics, regional politics, international politics, for example, forces Saddam to do some absolutely horrible things, not only using chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers in the battlefield, but also against his own people, most notoriously in the Halabja massacre as part of the Anfal genocide campaign against the Kurds, which really, for the first time, thrust into the international limelight the question of Kurdish people. What is to be done with them, for them? What are they to do for themselves? And especially in 1990, 1991, during and after the Gulf War, when hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Kurds flee to Iran and Turkey, and then the Kurdish question becomes even more pressing. Eventually, of course, with events in Turkey and Southeast Turkey, then things are going to go for Kurdish people in a completely different direction. So there's so much of this here in this history, in these two fine studies this tension on the one hand between particular sets of times and place and contexts and actors who are still operating very much in an international context and very much trying to do their share for the international context, affect the direction of international events to the extent that they can do so, but also to use some of those dynamics to their advantage. So this basically concludes my comments. And again, thank you both, Kate and Timothy. As a sort of parting thought, I was wondering if I may very briefly ask both of you some very specific questions. You're more than welcome to, by the way, comment on my suggestion, my interpretation of your research, especially at those 3 levels. But I had some very specific questions about your topics. For you, Timothy, what became of Ayad Said Sabit? You said he eventually left Tehran for Syria. What happened to him afterwards? Because from your notes, I saw that he lived until 2015. So I was wondering if you can briefly mention that. And in the case of Kate, I was wondering if you can discuss. I know I ascribed certain actions and dynamics and visions to Saddam. He saw himself, for example, as the great Mesopotamian king Nebuchadnezzar. But what were some of the in the 1980s, some of the international connections that Iraq tried to build outside the Eastern Bloc? You mentioned the embassy organization, and I was fascinated by it. I had a notion of those, but I didn't know that they were in so many countries and operating. Did they, for example, engage in did they have Iraqi cultural centers now, which basically every foreign embassy in Washington, D.C., for example, has? Turkey now is engaged in a lot of cultural diplomacy, my country. So I was wondering if you can comment on that, and I'll leave some of the other questions to folks attending. Thank you both very much. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Barin. A lot to think about there. And we have about 20 minutes left for discussion. And as I do not see yet a host of raised hands or questions entered via the Q&A function of Zoom, I would like to give Tim and then Kate each a chance to respond to both Barin's comments, but then perhaps also to each other's presentations. Kate, you had that opportunity a bit more than Tim did since you went second. But if you could keep these short so that we then have time to take more questions from the audience. To the audience, I would invite you to use the Q&A function if you're ready to type in a message. If not, to raise your hand, and we'll take questions from the audience immediately after short responses from Tim and then Kate. So Tim, to you first.
Sure, thank you, and thanks so much to Barin for these insightful comments, and to Kate for a excellent presentation. I'll just try to touch on 2 quick issues very briefly. One to Barin's question, and then secondly, just a kind of general response to some of the issues that he laid out. I do know that Sabit died in Italy at the end of his life, but to be honest with you, I really don't have a very good idea of his sort of peripatetic life after then. Speaking with people who are more familiar with Iraqi history than I am, such as Michael Degerald, one interesting resource that I've been made aware of are a lot of Facebook groups and social media groups of Iraqis who lived during this period, and in many ways are cataloging kind of oral histories, family albums, fathers, mothers, etc., who were active during these periods. I don't really have a good answer for how we can use those sources alongside resources like the Wilson Center Digital Archive and National Security Archive, the Hoover Archives, Kate mentioned, and so on. But I think this is going to be a question that we have to deal with, especially the closer that we get to the 1980s and 1990s. I know that Sabit had, I think, a son as well, but I think it raises interesting questions of ethics and memory, as well as historians reach out to the sons and daughters of people who were, often expelled or even murdered. Secondly, just a general remark about your comments that think is really provocative and generative. I think when we're working on the late 1970s and early 1980s, we face this big question that you highlight at the top of, are we talking about the global Cold War or just regional politics? I think one way of approaching this, or one thing that we have to be very aware of all the time, is are actors using mental models inherited from the Cold War, such as Motazeri coming up with this idea of an Islamic international, very much consciously modeled on socialist internationalism? Are actors just acting with purely regional dynamics, perhaps like the Iraqi Lebanon case that Dr. Teetson highlights? But then in some of my research, I've come across cases or asymmetries that I think are really interesting and raise the question of how certain actors are able to leverage the Cold War to their ends. To me, a really interesting example of this are the memoirs of a Iraqi Kurdish Islamist, Mullah Krekar, who is, I think, in exile in Norway, if I'm not mistaken. And Krekar describes after the Halabja massacres, he travels to Peshawar in Afghanistan to try to recruit attention from wealthy Gulf Arab donors to say, hey, look, you guys you claim to support the Islamic revival in Afghanistan and are giving these Afghans all this money, but here's a photo album of these massacred Kurds in Iraq, and please sort of help me internationalize the Kurdish Islamic struggle, just as you have internationalized the Afghan struggle. We're both kind of Iranian peoples. We're both struggling against a superpower-backed oppressive regime. This should be the exact same conflict from your guys' point of view. For obvious reasons, these Gulf donors don't give them their checkbook. But I think it raises interesting questions about how, if we assume that the Kurdish cause for self-determination is not intrinsically more just than the Afghan cause or Hazara nationalism or whatever, and yet one cause becomes much, much more internationalized and arguably more successful at its aims due to the ways in which it's able to channel Cold War funding streams and attention spans. Barin talked about how the Kurdish cause was really marginal in terms of international attention until very late in the 1980s. So I think paying attention to these moments of asymmetry, both of resources and attention, is really crucial as we try to isolate the regional from the Cold War.
Thank you, Tim. Kate?
Yeah, so Barin, Saddam has this mentality where he's trying to operate outside the Cold War, like he thinks he's not part of it, but he is part of it, because he can't tell the Soviets no more. He also is interested if the Americans want to have a rapprochement. So there's times he tries to act as if he's above the Cold War, but he definitely is part of it. He's tied to that dynamic, and the Soviets have been involved in Iraqi affairs before Saddam, the Ba'athist Party, finally came in power in 1968. So he inherits that, and he's not stupid in a sense that he's just going to completely disregard that. And they are Soviets, as much tension as there is between the two of them, that is their number one ally outside the Middle East. Saddam also, talking about the defender of the Arabs, the Ba'athist Party really thinks was an opportunity after Egypt and Israel participate in the Camp David Accords. And Saddam really jumps on that of like, look, Egyptians betrayed us, I'm here to help you. And now we have the Shah's fallen and the Shia are rising, the Persians, are rising. So Saddam really jumped on that. I am the defender of the Arab world from both the Persians and the Israelis. And so he tries to operate in this middle. And we have more records of his transcripts. Saddam was very much like Richard Nixon in that he recorded all of his cabinet meetings. And a lot of times the transcripts from those, a lot of those are from the 1990s. He goes on these rants and you can tell his poor cabinet's like, yes, sir. And they don't know what he's talking about because he's just rambling on about, the Soviets and now the Russians. And even scholars who read through them, it's hard sometimes because you're like, I don't understand what he's trying to get at. Going back to the embassy organizations, by the 1990s, those groups are much more attuned and organized. And so what you have in the 1990s, because the groundwork was laid in the 1980s, they will have events that celebrates quote unquote the Iraqi victory over Iran, and they invite dignitaries and diplomats to come to that, and media groups. They will organize protests. They definitely were very much on top of US and NATO action in Bosnia and Kosovo. And so whenever there were accidental killings of civilians in Bosnia, for example, they would organize, they would relate it back to the suffering of Iraqis is similar to suffering of children in Bosnia. And so those groups, because of the groundwork that they laid in the 1980s in those embassies, they become very much more attuned with like which groups are influential or not. In Russia, they make a lot of inroads with female groups, women's groups, and also farming groups. And so their hands are in, not, I want to say like I said, every cookie jar, but they definitely know which groups have the ear of which power is in charge of. The problem for the Iraqis in the 1990s is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, there's such a huge what's going to happen in Russia that they are scrambling, and they end up becoming in, not a debt, but intertwined with like Russian ultra nationalists who want to see the rise of Russia again and completely do not like anything socialism. And the Iraqis like, great, but the Russian nationalists are also like, Iraq, you don't really matter yet. And so the Iraqi, sometimes in some cases, those embassy organizations struggle to make inroads, especially in Russia in the beginning part of the 1990s. By later part, they have a great partnership with those groups.
Thank you, Kate. I see Professor Elizabeth Bishop in the audience, and I saw you had your hand raised. Did you have a question?
Well, I did have a question. I mean, I very much want to appreciate these wonderful papers, but I did want to ask, if time permits, a little bit more to drill down on this question of periodization. I've heard several references to inherit a situation. I've heard references to antecedents. I've heard references philosophers to back to the era of Said Qutb. So I was wondering if we could identify characteristics that are unique to the post-Soviet period, or also characteristics that transcend the rise and fall of the Hashemite monarchy, or the development of the Ba'ath Party institutions, for example. Thank you again for these wonderful presentations.
Thank you for the question, Professor Bishop. And since that question is to both of you, I'll ask Tim and Kate, I'll ask you both to speak to the question of periodization. But Kate, I will also ask you to answer a second question, which was submitted via the Q&A function. And this is from Ali Arslan, a senior IR student at Bilkent University. And he asks you to engage in a bit of hypothetical thinking. He asks why the Iraqi government did not pursue alliance building as a form of international outreach. So if you could speak to that question as well. Tim, I'll let you go first and speak to Professor Bishop's question.
Sure, thank you. And let me say, Professor Bishop, I've really enjoyed a lot of your work in the past, so it's a pleasure to see that you're here. From my perspective, periodization and turning points are really tricky, especially once we zoom the picture out from one particular national framework or the other. And even if we're talking about, say, the Today Party of Iran, as opposed to followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini, a lot of the turning points and breaking points are very different. Just to take one example in my own work, and just very practically in writing a book, in 1978, we can find all of these Afghans in the Islamic Republic receiving support from Iran. They're kind of all in the same place. If you look back earlier, a lot of the crucial turning points, say, for Afghan Islamists are very different from their Iranian counterparts. Afghanistan does not have a free kind of, does not have any kind of democracy until 1964, but then from 64 until 73, Afghanistan is much more open for political activism and publishing than Iran is, for instance. And so there's a lot of issues of kind of asymmetries between different national actors. And one thing I struggle with, if anybody has any tips on how to do this, is how to, get these actors who were in Tehran in 1979 and sort of figure out what the genealogies are that all drove them to meet in the same place. Broadly, though, I think since you referenced kind of post-Soviet history, and I think I heard something about Soviet chronologies in there, I would emphasize that for a lot of the actors I study, I think a really crucial period for them is the period from around 1970 to 1985. A lot of my actors, whether it's members of the Dawa party in Iraq or Iranian activists and ideologues like Jalaluddin Farsi, they really view détente between the United States and the Soviet Union as a great danger. Historically, they can look back at times when there have been close relations or cooled relations between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. It didn't lead to good results for Iran. They're very wary of a potential carve up of the Islamic world at this moment when the Soviet Union and the United States appear to be on speaking terms with one another. And I think this is one of the reasons that makes them very urgent about the need to come up with an alternative and to form these international alliances. And in some ways, the decline of détente is something that I think they can look forward to, and that it prevents the superpowers from colluding with one another. In the late 1970s as well, they, for understandable reasons, also view China as a fully paid up member of the superpower mafia, if you will. And it's indeed to try to overcome this sort of perceived collusion that I think there's such urgency and excitement in 78 and 79 among the actors that I study, that they're very open about how they finally have exposed how even China is also a hypocrite and a sellout as much as the United States and the Soviet Union are. Conversely, though, when we get to 1985 and things like the Geneva summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, some of the actors whom I look at, like a Lebanese intellectual, Saud al-Mawla, who writes for a lot of these Iraqi Islamist publications in Tehran, I think describes it as a summit of terrorists, or a summit of terror. For these actors, the prospect that the United States and Soviet Union are no longer going to be distracted in these proxy wars in settings like Angola or the Horn of Africa, but are instead going to cooperate with one another, is really, really bad news. It's an opportunity that they might collude and carve up the third world between them once more. The Iranian response to the Soviet collapse and perestroika is complex. I have an article that looks on some of this coming out soon. But broadly, I would just emphasize how looking at these emic sources, I think can really challenge the ways in which we conceive of Cold War periodization, or at least bring in new perspectives beyond, say, London, Paris, Washington, and Moscow, crucial though those actors were to these processes.
Thank you, Tim. And Kate, if I can ask you to answer two big questions in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, for sure. I think the question of periodization is difficult. And I think we've seen the fallout of, especially in the United States, the fallout of misperiodization. I don't know if that's a word, but especially for like the US military, like I said earlier, they used to view Iraq as like Iran-Iraq war, first Gulf, that was a triumph, no problem. And then OIF, invasion 2003, how did this all go wrong? And there's been a lot of scholarship recently by Samuel Helfont that looked at the 1990s and the fallout of the first Gulf War in Iraq and how that lays the groundwork for the troubles that the American military did encounter in 2003. And so with Saddam and the Ba'athist regime, to be honest, I'm not quite sure, because I don't think Saddam was quite sure how he viewed himself in this era. Do we blanket Saddam Hussein's regime just from when he officially comes into power, but he was always in the background, he was there in the early 70s? Do we start it with 1968 when the Ba'athists come to power, but yet the Ba'athists had a relationship with the Soviets? And so I think it's hard, and I think that's something that scholars that's something that has to be tackled now. And I know, like I said, there are scholars that are looking at it, but I think we've seen the troubles, and especially, like I said, for my employer, which again, this is my thoughts only, not theirs, of getting it wrong and just limiting it to wars and foreign conflicts, because there's so much more to the Ba'athist regime than just these wars with Iran, Kuwait, and then the US invasion, which kind of ties into the question of building alliances. To be honest, the Iraqis were pretty terrible alliance builders in the 1980s. They are working with the East Germans, the Bulgarians, for example, and I talked about the assassinations, and I mean, they're killing dissidents in the streets, but they also are working with the East German secret police and like learning tradecraft. And they kept wanting more and more. And the Stasi are like, we're not going to give you everything. And then the Stasi realizes that the Iraqis are using their trade crafts in East Germany on targets. And so you have that where a lot of countries that would have been allies are like, I don't think so. And then especially in the 1980s, you want to align yourself with Iraq, which had basically was a bit of a pariah of like invading Iran and the use of chemical weapons. In the 1990s, that's when Iraq really hones its alliance building. And that is part of the reason why the US faces such a tough time building the case for 2003, because the Iraqis have figured out that, okay, one, we also can't assassinate dissidents in the streets like this, but they start building alliances with France, England, Russia, and other countries, and as well as their soft power groups. They court US congressmen, senators, and not only build alliances with nation states, but also their civil societies. And the 1990s, Iraq is very good at building relationships and alliances that way, and very good at communicating that they are not the bad guy. They're the ones that are being discriminated or having American horrors afflict upon them. And so I think they learn their lessons that they can't be invited to somebody's house, trash it, and then expect to be invited back to the party again. They definitely learn that they have to play, not saying that the Iraqis were not suffering, but they have to be carry that image of being a victim of American action, and not Iraqis were the ones that, the Iraqis are the ones that started the war with Iran. They're the ones using chemical weapons against their own people. And so there's that change in image, mission, and tactics and building alliances. I hope that was quick enough. Sorry.
That was great. Okay, thank you, and thank you to everyone. We are occupying the Wilson Center webinar room, and I've learned through our collaboration that they take time very seriously, and so we're past 11:30 now, and so I'm going to have to call an end to this. But it's been wonderful, and so thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audience, especially those who ask questions. And I'd just like to close with an announcement that our next and last seminar for this series is on June 3rd. The title is Challenging the Norms of Warfare, Historical Perspectives from Yemen and Iraq. So we hope to see many, if not all of you then. But thank you again to the panelists, especially to Tim and Kate for their excellent presentations, and Barin for bringing it all together so nicely. So thank you all, and hope to see you on June 3rd.